Well, you all are heroic to hang in with all this. The two great faith models in the Old Testament are the Exodus, in which you move from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. And Golda Meir famously said that Moses led Israel for 40 years in the wilderness and finally brought us to the only place in the Near East where there's no oil. The other travel model is that we were in exile and we are going home to Jerusalem. That model basically comes out of 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 40 to 55, which is so well known to us because that's where Handel got most of the Messiah, was out of that stuff. And 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 40 to 55, imagines that if you build a highway and every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain made low and all flesh will see it together as the glory of the Lord leads Israel back home. That model was probably established by the elite Jews who were carried away into Babylon. There weren't so many of them, but they were the leadership. Babylon took the leadership away, because if you take the leadership away, you won't have a rebellion. So that little cadre of elite Jews had the experience of exile and restoration, and they were powerful enough to say that's the experience of all Jews. All Jews were in exile, and all Jews are coming home. And that leads to the political statement about next year in Jerusalem, which has served the contemporary state of Israel very well. All Jews will come back to Israel, or if you stay in New York, you should at least send money to support the Jews in Israel. In Isaiah 45, just one case study, the poet has God say, this is the most extraordinary verse. Isaiah 45:1 says, "Thus saith the Lord, Cyrus," who's the king of Persia, "Cyrus will be my Messiah who will lead the Jews home." And if you translate the word Messiah into Greek, Cyrus will be my Christ. So the Jews are going to be saved by a goy. And they must have resisted. They must have said, "I don't want to be saved by a goy," because in 45:9, 8 verses later, the poet scolds them and he says, "Does a potter say to the clay, 'Hey, you haven't got the handle right'?" No, a potter doesn't say that. Potter just, the clay just keeps turning on the wheel. It doesn't object to the potter. And then he says, "Does an embryo say to the mother in labor, 'How come you're grunting?'" No, the embryo just keeps moving. So if a clay doesn't question the potter, and if the embryo doesn't question the mother, then Israel shouldn't question God. So we are marching home to Jerusalem in the light of God. That's the model. Now, what I want to tell you is that they discovered that model wouldn't work. Because when they got back to Jerusalem, what they found out is that they were still in Persia. They were a colony of Persia, and they still had to pay imperial taxes. So it didn't make any sense to say we are in exile and we're going home to freedom and well-being. So they had to find a different model. So here's my hypothesis that I want to walk around. in the Persian period, those who discovered that exile homecoming wouldn't work as a model made a new model of accommodation and resistance. Accommodation to Persian reality and resistance because I'm a Jew. Well, you see where I'm going with this? The church in the U.S. national security state, I propose, can work with a model of accommodation and resistance, accommodation to the national security state, because it's very big and very tough, and resistance because I'm baptized and I belong to Jesus. Now, I assume that you are like me. I assume that most of us are largely accommodators. And the idea of resistance is a hard thing, particularly for Presbyterians, because Presbyterians get along with the government. Presbyterians have been the government, for God's sake. So what they did in the Persian period, if we date stuff correctly, is that they told stories of accommodation and resistance. Probably these stories are fiction, but the fiction offers models to young Jewish boys and girls about how to be a Jew in Persia, about how to be a Christian in East Germany, about how to be a member of a faith community in a society that doesn't want that faith community to have any energy. And I understand that to be basically a struggle always for our baptism. So to ask, how do you act about the empire and baptism if you are sealed as Christ's own forever? And they told these stories, and they offered them as models of agility. You got to be agile to keep your baptism in the empire. Wit. These stories are made to be entertaining. And irony, which means what you say isn't exactly what you mean. Oppressed people always operate with agility, wit, and irony. You remember the line in Fiddler on the Roof? They said, "Oh Lord, keep the Cossack soldiers far away from us." Or when Negroes sang, "Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus." The masters thought they were singing about God and heaven, and they were singing about the Underground Railroad to Ohio. But the masters didn't need to know that. So let me give you two book titles, and I'm going to talk about some biblical stories. The book titles are by James C. Scott, who is an anthropologist at Yale, and he has studied how peasant communities engage in resistance that is shrewd enough not to get shot or arrested. And the reason I tell you this is I think Christians in the United States now have to learn the arts of resistance. The first book is called The Weapons of the Weak. And the second book is called Domination and the Arts of Resistance. Now, I will tell you about the second one, that Scott begins his book with a Malaysian peasant proverb that tells you everything you need to know about Scott's work. It says, When the master goes by, the peasant bows deeply and farts. So if somebody calls you an old fart, take it as a sign of resistance. So resistance has got to be agile and ironic and shrewd and crafty and cunning. But in order to maintain a baptismal identity, you have to engage in resistance. Otherwise, you disappear in the woodwork of the national security state. So the church engages in resistance. It has soup kitchens. We don't think of it that way, but a soup kitchen is an act of defiance. Because it says to market ideology, these people matter. And we're going to value them. And if you begin to think about it, you can understand the mission of the church in terms of resistance. It's pretty timid. Will Willimon, the great Methodist bishop, wrote that bishops have to visit churches. And he was visiting this local Methodist congregation, and he went down in the basement, and they were running a soup kitchen, and this guy had a sweaty sink washing dishes. And Will's a little bit pious, and he said, "Are you enjoying what you're doing?" And the guy washing dishes said, "I hate it." He said, "Well, why are you doing it?" He said, "Well, Jesus put me here." And then he said to the bishop, "Where'd Jesus put you?"